If you thought that finding opportunities to do bird portraits is difficult, this is where you have to not just pay attention to one bird, but you have to focus on all the birds that make up a flock. And here's one example. This is a group of snow geese, and they're actually Ross's geese mixed in with them, which is a smaller version of the snow goose. Now look at all these different attitudes, all these different personalities. It is not just a pattern of birds, it is a mixture of birds that are relaxed, that are alert. The light is not hitting them all in the same way. And how do you make sense of that as a photographer? How do you frame your composition? That's what we're going to talk about in the next video, capturing birds in flocks. So many birds were gathered in front of us that it presented us with a new opportunity. Flocks of birds. We switched our attention from birds in the air to birds in the water. Now, when it comes to birds in flocks, I like to create nicely distributed patterns. And that means looking very carefully for the edges of your composition to make sure that they're all in balance. To make it a little bit easier, I chose a composition with a little bit of water at the bottom so that I could crop in if I want to tighten the composition a little bit after the fact. And then I began to look carefully for a space in the top of my composition where there were as few birds as possible that I had to slice through in order to complete my composition on the top end. What I set myself as a challenge as well, and what I discussed with Candace and Matthew to make it a little bit more challenging, was we should look for just a pattern of snow geese. We wanted to keep the dark geese out, ducks off to the side, and that meant looking very carefully and very critically at what was in front of us. I like doing that. The more I can pre-visualize the image I'm after, the easier it is to lock in on the perfect frame that materializes in front of you. We've got hundreds of snow geese in front of us, and that gives us a different opportunity than we've seen earlier today. Yeah, we started off with birds in landscapes, and then we came here and we started doing portraits of individuals, and then we practiced with birds in flight. But now it's time to refocus on birds in flocks. And this may seem really easy, because what could be easier than capturing images of all these snow geese that are milling around? But it's actually quite challenging, because I'm looking for a composition where we have snow geese evenly spread out with no big gaps in between, but also not too many birds overlapping with each other. And then, as the ultimate challenge, I'm looking for a way in which I can frame them with not too many birds kind of sticking in or out of the frame. That's a real juggle, isn't it?
Easier said than done.
Yeah. So, are you with me for this?
Yeah.
Okay. So, the challenge is a perfect pattern of snow geese. To capture this to its fullest potential, I'm going to close my aperture all the way. On this lens, that means 32. And then my shutter speed, I'm going to keep at around 300 to 400 of a second, because the birds are moving. You know, they're not in flight, so the movement is not as fast as what we practiced with before, but still I want to keep them crisp. At 400 of a second and f32, I'm getting an ISO of 2000, which is well within the range of what's going to yield a high quality image. So those are the settings. The tripod really helps to stabilize the camera, and now it becomes a matter of looking really intensively at this complicated pattern. There's always something changing, but in front of me I'm seeing the pattern emerge. I see birds with their heads down in the water, they're foraging, and I'm seeing other birds with their heads sticking up. I see a few birds interacting. So by having a little bit of water at the bottom, that makes it easier to crop in if I need to, and it stabilizes the composition on the bottom end. So now the challenge becomes to frame it on the top end. So that is where you have to make decisions. Now there's some birds landing. Managed to get one or two coming down. Oh, now I've got a nice open space on the top end. And let me just check that out. Oi, 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 see that. All right, can I share this with you, Candace?
Yep.
So this is what I'm talking about. See, there's just one head sticking in, but I've got a clean upper edge in the frame, and for the rest I've got a clean bottom end of the frame. Now this is where things are not quite perfect, but you see now it's a balanced composition, top and bottom. I'm refocusing, 1/3 of the way in, a little bit of water at the bottom end. And I'm beginning to look for individual characters. Even though it looks like a pattern of snow geese overall, once you start looking more carefully, you see that everyone has got a different body position. And I want to make sure that I've got one or two birds in the foreground that are the kind of characters that the viewer can identify with. So I'm looking for the moment when they're not sticking their heads down into the water, but when they're looking up. Oh, see two birds interacting, that was a great moment. What I'm doing for myself and what I'm now articulating for you is to create the search image. And that makes it easier for me to know when things are right. So I see more birds coming in from the back. Do you see them come in, swimming? Okay, that's a nice sub-pattern. Okay, taking a quick break to see whether the exposure is right. I'm not seeing anything that is going off the scale. The settings were in place, the birds were there, cameras were mounted on a tripod, we had a long lens. I used a zoom lens because that made it much easier to quickly adjust the composition depending on where the best edges in the frame were. And then it was just a matter of searching for the right moment. I waited for opportunities when there were just white snow geese in my frame, and there were a couple of really nice moments. In fact, the best moment came when the birds heard a plane in the distance, and suddenly they were all focused on that noise in the background. They stopped foraging, all the heads went up, and then they took off. We could not have foreseen that moment, but in fact we had the perfect settings on our camera. Infinite depth of field, high shutter speed. I'm really excited to see what we ended up with. All right, so another field experience. We moved very quickly from talking about bird portraiture to birds in flocks. And I didn't give you a chance to get back to me with questions and comments about that section. So we can do that now, but perhaps first, while it's fresh, I would love to hear back from you about what you just witnessed. What went through your head as you heard me articulate how I look at birds in flocks?
I did have another question that was about, you showed us those reflections, and Jory was saying, I often try to capture a bird and its reflection in the water, but I can't always get in the entire reflection. Is there ever sort of a time that a cutoff reflection is acceptable? And I know maybe that's a bigger question about, we talk about with humans, where is it okay to cut things off? What about with birds?
Well, it's everything is situational, there's not one perfect answer to that. I showed some images earlier on. Remember that duck with the perfect reflection, and the same with the great white egret? Of course, that's ideal, but you have to slice it where you find it. So, get a little bit closer to the water's edge. If the foreground vegetation cuts off the reflection, consider moving to the left, moving to the right. Yeah, that is when it comes back to vantage point decisions. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh,
Yes.
maybe one more, and then we'll.
Could I just follow on that? A question about when you're shooting reflections, because I love shooting water birds like you do. Often, for me, I feel like I'm struggling to make the bird itself equal or heavier in visual weight than the reflection. So as I'm trying to set up the composition, somehow yours, the bird was confined to the upper half of the picture, and yet yours worked beautifully. And I'm curious if you have kind of rules of thumb about this, or maybe it's just an aperture issue, and you've got the reflection in perfect focus as well.
I'm not sure that I understand your question. Can you try to rephrase it?
I didn't phrase it well as a question. I apologize.
Yeah.
How do you deal with composition issues that occur when you have a combination of a bird and its reflection, and therefore that in some ways relegates the bird itself to the top half of the frame?
Oh, I see. In other words, where do you put the emphasis? Is it on the reflection or on the bird
Precisely.
itself?
And do you include extra, blank space at the top to bring the bird down in the frame? Just how do you handle the composition when you've got a reflected water bird?
Yeah, I don't think there's an absolute answer to that. It's everything is situational. It relates back to the earlier question where somebody raised a question in the chat room is, can you cut off part of a reflection? Of course you can. So you can, perhaps you can reframe your thinking in another way as part of the answer to the question you raised. Is it about the bird, or is it about the composition overall? If you're primarily aiming to do a portrait of a bird, then the reflection is secondary. But if you're really moving towards an abstraction or an impression, then the bird is really just incidental. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So I wonder, if there are any questions raised about the earlier section of bird portraits, because we went quite fast from that into birds in flocks.
There is a question I have for you about bird portraiture, which is that when we take portraits of people, we often have a sense of what elements of a person, their expression, their countenance, brings out their individuality. What are you looking for when you bring out the individuality of a bird? This is something I'm always trying to do. I struggle with it. I still don't even know exactly what it is that I'm looking for.
That's a really good question, and that goes to the heart of portraiture, right? And I'm glad you're bringing it back to that, because I made a note to myself to bring this back to you. These references to the importance of foreground and background are really meant to push bird portraiture in the direction of human portraiture. What do studio photographers do? They pose their subjects in front of plain backgrounds, and it's either black or it is white. And what we can do by being conscious of foregrounds and backgrounds is really to replicate studio situations in the outdoors. And the fewer distractions there are, the more you focus on the subject. Then back to your question, how do you draw out the individuality? Well, it comes from paying attention to a bird's body language. And you saw that in that sequence where there was a pair of pintail ducks that were really relaxed, posing on that log, and then something happened and they became alert. And suddenly they looked very different. And that is exactly what I think is part of the answer to you, is look for ways in which birds express themselves, being alert, being relaxed, interacting with each other. Are their eyes closed? Are their eyes open? Or is the eye just half open? Is it a sleepy bird? Is it an alert bird? All these subtleties matter, and ultimately, the more of that you can be aware of, the more you can express about the bird, not just be a member of a species, but being an individual.
This is kind of an embarrassing question, but I've found myself making some noise to get birds to fly because I want to get a picture of them in flight. Oh, I kind of have a feeling that you're going to hit me.
Well, I saw your expression, and thank you for bringing that up, because I think we've all made mistakes, as we go about approaching birds, and you don't know any better, you get too excited, and you flush birds unwittingly, or you don't know enough about how sensitive situations are around nests, for instance, and nothing wrong with making mistakes. We all learn from our experience, but deliberately spooking birds and making them fly, I'd rather not do that, because there will always be another opportunity. And I think there's ultimately, I believe in just letting the birds determine what my opportunities are going to be. I have my eyes on the horizon. Whether something happens in the next 5 or 10 minutes, that's not as important as leaving at the end of an encounter and feeling good about yourself. Yeah.
Thank you for bringing that up as well.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So perhaps I can connect this with another question that was raised earlier on about baiting birds, because now we're diverting from birds as subjects into the ethics of how we work with birds, and things that were acceptable 30 years ago and 20 years ago, we're looking at differently now. Our society is evolving. We're thinking differently about how we relate to each other. And there's definitely been an evolution in our thinking about birds as well. Things that were considered acceptable now, things that were considered acceptable back then, I really don't want to pass on to the next generation of bird photographers anymore. So baiting birds. I'm not a great fan of that, to tell you the truth. I know, for instance, that there's opportunities to go into the northern plains in midwinter, and people attract owls using mice, and then the owls fly towards the mice. And of course, at the end of the session, there's no mice left, but there's a lot of owl pictures. I'm not so sure that that's going to be something that you're going to feel happy about 5 to 10 years from now. So here's the golden rule. My friend Galen Rowell, a great mountaineering photographer, and I hear you not, we had discussions about this. And the golden rule is, if you do not feel comfortable disclosing the conditions that led to your photograph, then you may want to think twice about doing that again. So you need to feel good about what it took you to make the photograph. And then I throw it back to you with your individual ethics, but I would also like to set the bar higher for every one of us. Because, birds are dependent on us. So we need to look out for their welfare.
Thank you. And I just want to say kudos again to bringing that up, because a lot of people in the chat room are saying thank you, because not everybody would actually bring that up. So appreciate that. Yeah. Thank you.
So, no, I really appreciate that. And so now, however, to take it back to the situation where we were at in Colusa, in that wildlife refuge, we were sitting there with those birds, and when you're stationary and you're really attuned to the birds in front of you, then you see how alert they are and what spooks them. And periodically there were planes coming over, there were cars coming by, and they would spook the birds. And after you witness that a couple of times, then you can insert yourself into that situation. So you're not the actor, you just react to the disturbance caused by somebody else. And that is often a much better way to achieve a similar effect, whether it is a bird taken off or a bird becoming alert.
Great.
Yes, please. Jeff has a question.
Just a quick question, and it kind of bridges the gap between portraits and flock behavior. How do you discipline yourself in that kind of setting to be cognizant of everything that's around you? Because it's so easy to be singularly focused on one portrait or one flock, but there may be a spectacular image elsewhere. So do you tend to maintain that single focus, or do you have a 360-degree view all the time?
That's a good point. Yeah, my friend Jay Mizell, who's one of the great photographers of our time, Jay had so many great statements. He said, if things are looking really good in front of you, it's time to look behind you. So, and that's certainly the case in a wildlife refuge like Calusa, where there's so much action. So periodically check yourself. Take yourself out of the experience. Take a minute to look back at the sequence of images that you just made. And then go back into it. Does that help? Or what can you give a specific example?
Oh, I have found myself at times so focused on one thing that I miss something else around me. So I think you've answered the question. You need to give pause and look around.
Yeah. Get really focused on what's in front of you, and then periodically scan what is happening on either side of your view. So before we go on, I would like to make a couple of points, because we've been looking at a lot of equipment in the field, the cameras that I was using, and some of you who are really observant probably noted that early in the morning I didn't have a lens hood on my long lens, and then later on, suddenly, magically, the lens hood appeared, right? Well, these lens hoods can get in the way. And with early morning light, I'm not so worried about any reflections that may interfere with the optics. But later in the morning, and especially when we started working with those birds in flocks, there was a cross light, and that's when I put the lens hood on. The other thing that you may have noticed was that Matt, one of our two students, was using one of those half gimbal heads. I made a reference to that earlier on when people asked, do I ever use a gimbal? And I said, well, it's kind of a big cumbersome thing. But that half gimbal head, when you see Matt again, check that out. And then as another detail, something that I highly recommend to any of you is to consider using quick release plates on your camera that connect with your tripod heads, because that makes it so much faster to switch from one lens to the other. And the next time you see my gear in action, you'll notice those quick release plates. And then there was yes.
I saw in many of your images that portrayed you and your camera, you had an L bracket on, but you haven't used it yet. You just leave them on all the time?
You're really observant, yeah. Now we're getting into the gear details, right? Yeah, those L brackets fit around my camera, and they enable me to go quickly from a horizontal to a vertical position. But I only use that L bracket really with short lenses. With the long telephoto lenses, I rotate the camera around the lens collar. But it's on there all the time. What is not on my camera, and you may have noted that as well, no camera straps. Yeah, I don't walk around with a 600 millimeter lens around my neck. So why use a camera strap when you're not going to use it? They just get in the way. And when there's wind, it begins to interfere with the stability of your rig. So keep things as simple as you can. It's just a detail, but all the details matter. And on that front, too, you noted that as I'm working in the field with Matt and with Candace, we just have one camera and one lens mounted on a tripod with us. All the rest of the gear is someplace else. You do not want to be, a donkey with everything, strapped to your body. That's really the point I want to make. You want to be free and easy. The last point I want to make, earlier in the portrait session, you heard me talk about moving from a wide open aperture to an aperture that is 1 to 2 stops down, so that you can get the whole bird within your depth of field. What I did not stress is that when you do that, you also increase the effective sharpness, because every lens is not as sharp wide open as it is at f8 or ideally at f11. So keep that in mind as well with your aperture choices. And I hope that earlier in the course I said enough about the new freedom of finding optimum combinations of aperture and shutter speed that are caused by the liberation of making your ISO the enabler. You've probably been wondering about this image of the puffins, right? That has been on screen here for quite a while. I wanted to share that with you because this is also an image of birds in a flock. And these birds are in Scotland. You know, it's on an offshore island, and the puffins would come in, and this is one of the rocks where they would like to land. And it was also a socializing point. So a convenient place for them to land, and then they would begin to interact. And that gave me the opportunity to start searching for some interest here. In this case, these two birds are, you know, recognizing each other, no idea what they're saying, but clearly there's some behavior going on. And then the rest is just a supporting cast. Well, actually, these two are also interacting with each other, and these are just checking out the rest of the scene. So these are all birds with personality, and that takes it beyond something like this pattern. This is a colony of king penguins on South George Island, which is one of my favorite places on the planet to photograph birds. Immense colonies of penguins. This colony numbered well over 100,000. And by climbing up on a hill behind the colony, I was able to get an overview. And then I just looked for the perfect composition that is a mix of adult birds in white and black and yellow, and the juvenile birds in brown. So, and that is when it becomes important to look for a universal distribution. I look carefully around the edges of the frame. This is a different way to show a king penguin colony. It began to snow, and I thought it would be interesting to include a sense of the atmospheric conditions in this colony view. So in the previous image, my aperture was closed down to f22 so that I had an extended depth of field. In this case, my aperture was also f22, but then I had to raise the shutter speed because if I did not use a fast shutter speed, all these snowflakes would have become little streaks, and then you're not looking at snow anymore. So this is a perfect example of using ISO as an enabler, because I knew I needed an extended depth of field. Aperture goes to f22, so you see even these birds in the background are sharp, and I needed a fast shutter speed, and my ISO was my best friend, and it enabled me to execute the image I wanted. Here's another example of king penguins in a flock, but using a different technique. I was still standing on that hillside, overlooking the colony, but this time I went for a much slower shutter speed. This shutter speed was around 1 second. And the effect is that some birds are standing still, they're not moving, so they're sharply defined, but quite a few others are moving about in the colony, and they're becoming ghost images. And this is a different way. So it's a little bit challenging under the conditions of South George Island, where it's often very windy. So when you use a shutter speed of a full second, you have to be very careful that the camera shake caused by the wind is not ruining your image. So in this case, it's not just one frame, but it's dozens of frames, and really paying attention to the wind gust. But I like this image because it's more challenging, and aesthetically it goes a step beyond the regular portrayal of a king penguin colony. Flamingos in East Africa. I hope some of you viewing the course have had a chance to see flamingos for themselves in the Great Rift Valley, up and down East Africa. There are these enormous congregations of flamingos. This is in Lake Nakuru. The conventional way is to make them all sharp, but in this case, I used, again, a slow shutter speed of around 1 to 2 seconds, and some of the birds are moving and the others are sharp. And it leads to a real impressionistic rendering. And the water motion also adds to that a little bit, so it's partially blurry, partially sharp. If you want to experiment with this yourself, be really careful in how you go about doing this. Really start looking for individual birds that are standing still, especially those in front of your composition, because that is where the eyes of your viewers will go towards. Here's another way to make your images of birds in flocks more challenging. This is an albatross colony in the Falkland Islands, and this is a seabird city. All of these birds are sitting on nests, and I chose a composition that creates a perfect pattern from edge to edge. And then I started looking for opportunities to include something else as a counterpoint to the pattern. A bird in flight passing by. So that was my search image. That became my concept. And I had the settings figured out. And that meant f32 for an extended depth of field. And then I had to find a shutter speed that was fast enough that a bird passing through the frame would be slightly blurred, but not so blurred that it became unidentifiable. In this case, that was around 125th of a second. And with a sunny situation, I had enough light to do that within a reasonable ISO setting. So, of course, this meant that I had to stand there for quite a while because I didn't want an albatross to fly into the middle of the frame because it would have been too distracting, but tucked away into an upper corner, left or right, it made a very nice complement, a counterpoint to the pattern of the bird sitting on the ground. One more scene with king penguins. And these birds, of course, go from sitting on land to going off into the water because they go out as fishing parties. And from time to time they come swimming down the beach, and I saw that a couple of times, and then we realized we had a pattern of bird behavior. We ran to a dune and we sat up there, and then we waited for the birds to swim by.